When we think of the fall of the Roman Empire, a specific set of images immediately comes to mind. Cities, burning in the night, massive hordes of barbarian warriors crashing against the shields of terrified Roman legionaries, emperors assassinated in dark corridors, a civilization overwhelmed by outside forces it could no longer control. This is the story we have been told for centuries, but it is only half of the truth. Long before the first barbarian breached the gates of Rome, the empire had already been hollowed out from the inside. It was not destroyed by a superior military strategy. It was not dismantled by foreign kings. Rome was brought to its knees by an invisible enemy, an enemy created by the empire itself. An enemy that lived in the pockets of every citizen, every merchant, and every soldier, the Roman coin. This is the story of one of the earliest large-scale inflation crises in recorded history. It is a story of absolute power, institutional fraud, and the silent economic treason that tore apart the greatest civilization of the ancient world. To understand how Rome died, we must first look at how it thrived. During the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Roman Empire experienced an era of unprecedented stability and prosperity. This period was known as the Pax Romana. The borders were secure, trade flowed seamlessly from the misty shores of Britannia to the blazing deserts of Egypt. A merchant could load a ship with grain in Alexandria and sell it in the markets of Rome without fear of piracy or foreign tariffs. But this massive, interconnected global economy required one essential element to function: trust. And in the Roman world, trust was forged in silver. The foundation of the Roman economy was a silver coin known as the denarius. Under the reign of Rome's first emperor, Augustus, the denarius was struck with roughly 95% pure silver. It was physical, undeniable wealth. When a Roman legionary held a denarius in his hand, he knew exactly what it was worth. It held intrinsic value. Because of this purity, the denarius became one of the most trusted and widely used currencies in the ancient world. Even tribes living far beyond the borders of the empire traded using Roman silver. But running an empire of that magnitude was unimaginably expensive. Rome had to maintain thousands of miles of roads. It had to build massive aqueducts, temples, and entertainment arenas to keep the population satisfied. Most importantly, it had to pay for its military. The Roman army was the largest and most professional standing military force on the planet. Hundreds of thousands of heavily armed men, stationed on freezing frontiers, required constant and guaranteed payment. As long as the empire was expanding, this system worked flawlessly. Conquering new lands meant capturing new silver mines, new slaves, and massive hordes of foreign treasure. The spoils of war fed the Roman economy, but by the 2nd century AD, the expansion slowed and eventually plateaued. The empire had reached its natural geopolitical limits. There were no more wealthy kingdoms left to conquer. Instead of going on the offensive, the Roman legions were now forced to play defense. They had to hold the line against increasingly aggressive Germanic tribes in the north and the formidable Parthian Empire in the east. Wars of conquest were highly profitable. Wars of defense were a bottomless financial black hole. The state was suddenly spending more gold and silver than it was bringing in. To make matters worse, Rome suffered a devastating biological blow. In the late 2nd century, returning legions brought back a deadly disease from the east, known today as the Antonine Plague. Millions of Roman citizens died. The population plummeted. Fewer people meant fewer taxpayers. Fewer taxpayers meant less revenue for the state. But the massive costs of the army and the bureaucracy did not decrease. The emperors were trapped. They needed more money to pay the troops and protect the borders, but they could not simply dig more silver out of the ground. So, the state discovered a lethal, institutional cheat code. They realized they could manipulate the currency itself. This process is known as debasement, and it began as a slow, almost unnoticeable whisper. Emperor Nero was the first to significantly experiment with this dangerous tool. To fund the rebuilding of Rome after the Great Fire, and to pay for his lavish golden house, Nero quietly ordered the imperial mints to reduce the amount of pure silver in the denarius. He dropped it from roughly 95% to 90%. The remaining percentage was filled with cheap, worthless metals like copper or bronze. On the outside, the coin looked exactly the same. It still bore the face of the emperor. It still carried the authority of Rome. But by reducing the silver content, the state could produce significantly more coins from the same silver supply. They had effectively created wealth out of thin air. At first, the Roman public did not notice the fraud. The newly minted coins circulated alongside the older, purer ones. But this was crossing a dangerous psychological and economic threshold. The emperors had tasted a forbidden power. They realized that whenever the treasury was empty, they didn't have to cut spending or raise taxes. They could just dilute the currency. What started as a slight reduction under Nero soon became a deliberate, systemic policy. By the time of Emperor Trajan, the silver content gradually declined to around 85%. Under Marcus Aurelius, it fell to roughly 75%. But the true acceleration of this economic treason occurred during the Severan dynasty in the early 3rd century. Emperor Septimius Severus seized the throne through a brutal civil war. He knew that his power did not rest on the approval of the Senate or the love of the people. His power rested entirely on the swords of his soldiers. On his deathbed, Severus reportedly gave his sons a chilling piece of political advice: be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and despise all others. His son, Caracalla, took this advice to heart. To secure the loyalty of the legions, Caracalla issued massive, unprecedented pay raises for the military. To fund this explosion in state spending, he aggressively debased the currency. He reduced the silver in the denarius to barely 50%. He even introduced a completely new coin, the Antoninianus. The state officially declared that this new coin was worth 2 denarii, but the Roman people quickly realized that it only contained the silver equivalent of 1.5 denarii. The government was forcing the public to accept a currency overvalued by state decree. This is the insidious nature of debasement. It is a hidden tax, a tax that doesn't require tax collectors or senatorial decrees. It simply steals the purchasing power from the citizens' savings while they sleep. But economic mathematics is unforgiving. You cannot alter the fundamental laws of supply and demand with an imperial decree. As millions of these diluted, copper-washed coins flooded the markets, a terrifying reality began to set in. Merchants, bakers, and blacksmiths realized that the coins they were receiving were essentially worthless. If a coin only had half the silver it used to have, a merchant required twice as many coins to sell the same loaf of bread. Prices began to rise. At first, it was gradual, but as the 3rd century progressed, the debasement became desperate and chaotic. The empire plunged into a 50-year nightmare known as the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome was torn apart by continuous civil war. More than 26 different men claimed the title of emperor. Most of them were military generals who seized power by marching their legions on Rome. And to keep those legions loyal, every new emperor had to instantly promise them a massive cash bonus. To pay these bonuses, the emperors ordered the mints to work day and night, producing millions of highly debased coins. By the reign of Emperor Gallienus, around 260 AD, the denarius was almost entirely copper. It often contained only trace amounts of silver. The coins were so poorly made that the thin silver wash would rub off in a person's hand. leaving a dull brown piece of bronze. Trust in the Roman state evaporated completely. Massive inflation took hold of the empire like a suffocating plague. A measure of Egyptian wheat that cost a few drachmas in the 2nd century suddenly cost hundreds of thousands of drachmas. Prices rose dramatically, in some cases by many multiples. The economic foundation of the ancient world completely shattered. The very soldiers that the emperors were desperately trying to pay realized that their massive wages could no longer buy them food. A sack of coins was literally worth less than the bag holding it. Because the money was severely devalued, trade increasingly shifted toward barter and local exchange. A merchant in Gaul would not risk his life transporting wine to Rome if he was going to be paid in useless copper. Farmers stopped bringing their grain to the city markets. Why trade real, life-sustaining food for fake money? Cities faced starvation. The complex, highly organized Roman economy began to heavily rely on primitive barter. Even the Roman government realized its own money was garbage. When state officials went to collect taxes, they increasingly demanded taxes be paid in kind, alongside coin payments. They demanded physical wheat, livestock, leather, and forced human labor to sustain the army. The state became an extortion racket, consuming its own citizens just to survive another day. Rome was dying. In 284 AD, an iron-fisted military commander named Diocletian seized the throne. Diocletian realized that if the economy was not stabilized, the empire would splinter into pieces permanently. He successfully reorganized the military and secured the borders. But Diocletian was a soldier, not an economist. He believed he could solve a systemic financial collapse with authoritarian military discipline. In 301 AD, he issued the infamous Edict on maximum prices. It was an unprecedented attempt to legally freeze the entire Roman economy. Diocletian's decree listed the absolute maximum price for over 1,000 specific goods and services. It dictated the exact price of a pound of beef, a pair of shoes, a tunic, and the daily wage of a carpenter or a teacher. The penalty for disobeying the edict or selling goods above the set price was death. Diocletian believed he could simply command the inflation to stop. He thought he could terrorize the market into submission. He was disastrously wrong. The edict on maximum prices was a catastrophic failure from the moment it was issued. Because the legally mandated prices were set far below the actual cost of production, merchants simply stopped selling. Farmers refused to bring their goods to the market, knowing they would have to sell them at a massive loss or be executed. Legal, open markets vanished overnight across the empire. Instead, a massive empire-wide underground black market exploded. People traded in secret, at realistic prices, hidden from the eyes of imperial soldiers. The state's attempt to artificially control the economy had completely paralyzed it. The edict was quietly ignored and eventually abandoned. But the damage was irreversible. The middle class of the Roman Empire, the merchants, the artisans, the civic leaders, was severely weakened by the inflation. Desperate citizens, unable to survive in the starving, crumbling cities, made a tragic choice. They abandoned their urban lives and fled to the countryside. To avoid starvation and the crushing burden of state taxes, ordinary Romans bound themselves to wealthy, powerful landowners. They gave up their freedom in exchange for a small piece of land to farm and the military protection of the local lord. They were no longer free citizens of Rome. They were legally tied to the soil. This demographic shift marked the death of the classical Roman economy, and in its ashes, it contributed to the long-term transition toward medieval serfdom and feudalism. A few decades later, Emperor Constantine attempted to fix the currency crisis. He introduced a new, pure gold coin called the solidus. the solidus was a brilliant success. It stabilized the high-level economy and remained the standard gold currency of the Byzantine Empire for another 700 years. But it created a devastating two-tier society. The military, the high-ranking bureaucrats, and the extremely wealthy used the pure gold solidus. They were insulated from the economic pain. But the common people, the farmers, the workers, the vast majority of the empire, did not have gold. They were forced to continue using the worthless, hyperinflated copper coins for their daily survival. The wealth gap became an unbridgeable chasm. The Roman state had become an oppressive, parasitical machine. It existed only to extract wealth from its impoverished citizens to feed a massive military and a bloated bureaucracy. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the civic pride that had built Rome was dead. When the barbarian tribes finally crossed the frozen rivers of the Rhine and the Danube, they did not face a unified, defiant Roman population. They found a society that was deeply exhausted. In many provinces, the heavily taxed and oppressed citizens put up almost no resistance to the invaders. For a starving farmer crushed by Roman tax collectors, a Germanic warlord seemed less like a conqueror and more like a change of management. The barbarian invasions were not the sole cause of the fall of Rome, but the final catalyst. The barbarians simply kicked down the door of a house that had already rotted from the inside. Rome was not murdered. It committed economic suicide. Absolute power collapsed the moment the currency that funded it lost its integrity. When the Roman state decided it could manipulate reality, debase its wealth, and create infinite money to fund infinite wars, it signed its own death warrant. But inflation was merely a symptom of a much darker structural rot. Rome wasn't just destroyed by a failing economy and desperate emperors. For centuries, the empire was physically held hostage, extorted, and ultimately auctioned off to the highest bidder by the very men hired to protect it. To see exactly how an elite unit of bodyguards turned the entire Roman Empire into their personal treasury, click the video on your screen right now to watch the true story of the Praetorian Guard.